The morning Della Bancroft walked into the Calhoun County courthouse with her husband's deed folded inside her coat pocket. The sky above Redemption Creek, Texas, was the color of a bruise healing purple at its edges, gold where the sun fought through, and wide enough to swallow every single one of her fears, if only she had let it. She had not slept the night before. She had not slept well in the 4 months since Thomas Bancroft had been thrown from his horse on the Ridge Road, landing in such a way that the doctor from 3 towns over had come, looked, pressed his lips together, and shaken his head with the practiced sorrow of a man who had delivered bad news too many times to let it cost him much. Thomas had lingered 2 days, holding her hand with diminishing strength until the grip went slack entirely, and then it was just Della and 40 acres of rocky Texas soil, and a boy named Eli who was 8 years old and did not yet fully understand that his father was never coming back through that door. She was 29 years old. She had calloused hands and dark brown hair that she kept pinned at the nape of her neck, because there was simply no time for vanity on a working homestead. She had eyes the color of creek water in summer, somewhere between green and gray, and a jaw that people in Redemption Creek described as determined, which was a polite frontier way of saying stubborn. She carried herself with the particular dignity of a woman who has learned that the world will not hand you anything, and who has decided that this is fine, because she has 2 hands of her own. The deed was legitimate. She had watched Thomas sign it, had watched the 2 witnesses at the land office in Abilene put their names to it 3 years prior when they had first come out to this part of Texas from Missouri, full of hope and drought-resistant seed. The deed named Thomas James Bancroft as the rightful owner of the parcel of land along Redemption Creek, 40 acres bounded by the cottonwood stand to the north and the dry gulch to the south. It was good land, stubborn land. Land that fought back every plow and rewarded the effort anyway with a harvest that kept them fed and occasionally left enough over to sell. What the deed did not say, and what the law in Texas in the year 1878 did not easily accommodate, was that Thomas James Bancroft was dead, and that his wife intended to carry on without him. Della had spent 2 weeks writing letters to men she could not afford to hire. She had spent another week riding the 15 miles into Redemption Creek every other day to consult with the town's lone attorney, a man named Gerald Hicks, who wore a vest that had seen better decades and spoke with the slow confidence of someone who charged by the hour. Gerald Hicks had told her that filing a deed transfer on behalf of a deceased husband was complicated. He had told her that she would need to present the original deed, a certified copy of the death certificate, and a witness affidavit attesting to her identity and her relationship to the deceased. He had also charged her $1.50 for that information, which Della had paid from the small tin she kept behind the flour sack in the kitchen cabinet, a tin that was getting lighter with every visit. She had the death certificate. She had gotten it from the county records in Abilene, riding out there herself with Eli on the seat beside her, the boy pressing his face against her arm the whole way, because he was beginning to understand now, and the understanding sat heavy on both of them. She had the deed. She had a written statement from her nearest neighbor, widow Agnes Purdy, attesting that Della Bancroft was indeed the lawful wife of the late Thomas Bancroft and the rightful heir to his property under Texas intestacy law. What Della did not have was a second witness. Gerald Hicks had been very clear that the county clerk's office in Redemption Creek required 2 witness signatures on the affidavit, not 1. Agnes Purdy was one. She needed someone else. Someone who lived in or near Redemption Creek and could appear with her at the courthouse, or whose signature she could obtain beforehand. She had asked around. She had approached the feed store owner, who had said he did not get involved in legal matters. She had asked the minister at the small Baptist church, who had said he would pray for her circumstances, but could not in good conscience sign a legal document about a land matter he had no direct knowledge of. She had even asked Gerald Hicks himself, who had noted with transparent insincerity that it would be a conflict of interest for him to serve as a witness given that he had advised her in the matter. So on a Tuesday morning in early April of 1878, Della Bancroft buttoned Eli into his cleanest shirt, left him with Agnes Purdy, and a stern instruction to stay out of Agnes's vegetable patch, hitched her bay mare to the small wagon, and drove 15 miles to Redemption Creek with one witness signature on her affidavit and a hollow space where the second should have been, telling herself the whole way that she would figure something out when she arrived. The Calhoun County Courthouse was the most substantial building in Redemption Creek, which was not saying a great deal. It was 2 stories of limestone block that had been hauled in at considerable expense and assembled with evident pride, topped with a wooden cupola that the townspeople had painted white every spring for the past decade. The county clerk's office occupied the front room on the ground floor, just to the right of the main entrance, behind a long wooden counter that was scarred with years of papers and ink bottles and the elbows of the frustrated and the hopeful. The county clerk's name was Vernon Pratt. He was 44 years old and had held his position for 11 years, appointed initially by the county judge, who was his wife's uncle. He wore a wool coat regardless of the weather and kept his thinning hair brilliantined flat against his skull. He was not a cruel man in the way that some men are deliberately cruel. He was, instead, the kind of man who mistakes small institutional authority for actual superiority, who has learned over years of sitting behind that counter that he has the power to say no and almost never the obligation to say yes, and who has come to find a quiet, mean satisfaction in the former. When Della walked up to the counter and placed her documents carefully on its surface, straightening them with hands she would not allow to tremble, Vernon Pratt looked at them over the tops of his spectacles with the expression of a man who has already decided the outcome. She told him what she needed clearly and without embellishment. She presented the deed. She presented the death certificate. She presented the affidavit with Agnes Purdy's signature and the blank second line. She explained that she was seeking to have the property transferred into her name as the surviving spouse, that she had the legal documentation to support the claim, and that she required only that he process the filing. Vernon Pratt picked up the affidavit. He read it with theatrical slowness. He set it down. He picked up the deed. He held it briefly toward the window as if inspecting it for watermarks. He set it back down. Then he laughed. It was not a large laugh. It was not even a particularly loud one. It was the kind of laugh that is designed to diminish a short, exhaled sound accompanied by a slow shake of the head, a laugh that said, without requiring words, that the person being laughed at was naive in a way that was more pitiable than offensive. "Mrs. Bancroft," he said, setting the papers down with the careful deliberateness of a man returning objects to a shelf, "I can see you've gone to some trouble here. But you are missing your second witness signature, which is required under county procedure. Without it I cannot process this filing." "I am aware," Della said. Her voice was steady. She had practiced steadiness the entire drive in. "I had hoped to obtain a second signature here in town this morning before presenting the documents." "And did you?" "Not yet." He spread his hands in a gesture of mock helplessness. "Then I'm afraid there's nothing I can do for you today. I can find someone this morning. I simply need to know if you will accept the filing before the office closes." Vernon Pratt looked at the clock on the wall behind him. It was 9:30 in the morning. The office was open until 4. He looked back at her. He picked up her affidavit again, and this time he smiled at it, the way a man smiles at a joke only he is in on. "The thing is," he said, still looking at the paper, "even if you got your second witness, there are questions here about whether a woman can file a deed transfer on behalf of a deceased husband without a male administrator appointed by the court. Texas law on this point is," he paused, affecting consideration, "not entirely settled in favor of independent filings by widows." This was a partial truth wrapped around a deliberate untruth, which was Vernon Pratt's preferred method of discouragement. Texas law did recognize a widow's right to inherit and hold property. The Homestead Act and various state provisions had made this reasonably clear. What Pratt was doing was erecting procedural fog, hoping she would get confused and go away. Della recognized it. She had dealt with enough men like Vernon Pratt in her life to know the shape of it. "With respect," she said, "the Texas Constitution of 1876 provides for a widow's right to the community homestead. The property was acquired during our marriage. I am entitled to file." Pratt blinked. That was not what he had expected her to say. He recovered quickly. He set the affidavit down again, this time with a quality of finality to the gesture. "Regardless, the missing witness signature is a concrete procedural issue. Come back when you have that addressed." He turned away from her, moving to the filing cabinets along the back wall with the practiced indifference of a man who has decided the conversation is over. Della stood at the counter with her hands pressed flat against its surface, looking at the documents she had driven 15 miles to file, and she breathed carefully in and out through her nose the way she always did when she was working hard not to say something she could not take back. Her throat was tight with a feeling she refused to name. She was not going to cry in Vernon Pratt's county clerk's office. She was not going to do that. She had just picked up the documents to fold them back into her coat pocket and think about what to do next when the door behind her opened, bringing in a gust of cool April air and the sound of boots on the wooden floor. She did not turn around immediately. She was focused on her folding, on the careful management of her expression, on the arithmetic of her situation. What it would cost to drive back here, what it would cost to leave the land in legal limbo for another week, what it would cost her harvest if she could not get the irrigation easement sorted out, because the irrigation easement was the reason she needed this deed filed in her name quickly and not at her leisure. A man 2 parcels over named Calder Beaumont had been making noises about that easement since Thomas died, and those noises were getting louder. The boots stopped at the counter beside her. She looked up. The man standing next to her was tall in the way that men who spend years in the saddle are tall, not imposing, but present, built for distance rather than confrontation. He had dark hair that was growing out from under a flat-brimmed hat he had just removed, holding it against his chest in the unconscious courtesy you sometimes saw in men who had been raised with manners, and then spent 20 years in rough country that had not knocked them out of him. He had a jaw that was dark with 2 days of beard and eyes that were a warm shade of brown that in certain lights looked almost amber. He was wearing a canvas work coat over a collarless shirt, and his boots were the boots of a working man, quality leather, but worn in the way that honest labor wears things, not carelessly but consistently. She put his age at somewhere in his early 30s. There was experience in his face, but not yet the hardening that came later, when a man had let the country grind away at whatever had been soft in him. He was not looking at her. He was looking at Vernon Pratt's back with a patient expression that suggested he had spent time waiting for inattentive clerks before and had made his peace with it. Vernon Pratt turned from his filing cabinet, saw the man, and underwent an immediate transformation. The theatrical indifference dropped away. He moved back to the counter with a readiness he had not extended to Della. "Mr. Abbott," he said, "what can I do for you?" The man, Abbott, placed a folded paper on the counter. "Property tax receipt. Wanted to get it filed before end of quarter." Of course. Pratt took the paper, unfolded it, glanced at it, nodded. "This will take about 10 minutes to process and log." "Are you in a hurry?" "No particular hurry," Abbott said. While Pratt moved to process the receipt, the man named Abbott glanced sideways at Della in the way that people standing at counters together do, a brief, acknowledging look, not intrusive. He saw her face. Whatever he saw there, and Della did not know what it was, because she had not yet fully mastered the expression she was attempting to wear, made him look again, more carefully this time. She looked back at him. Neither of them spoke for a moment. "Pardon me for asking," he said, quiet enough that Pratt would not easily hear him from the back of the room, "but are you having trouble with your filing?" Della considered several responses and settled on honesty because she was too tired and too tightly wound to bother with the polite deflection she might otherwise have offered. I am short one witness signature on an affidavit. I cannot file my deed transfer without it. He nodded slowly. What sort of deed transfer? My husband passed away 4 months ago. I am trying to have the property transferred to my name. He looked at her for a moment with the straightforward sympathy of someone who has experienced loss and is not condescending about it. I'm sorry for your loss, he said, and he meant it in the way that phrase almost never meant anything but occasionally from the right person did. Thank you, she said. There was a brief silence. Abbott turned this over for a moment. I could sign the affidavit, he said. If you need a second witness, I'm a resident of Calhoun County, been here 3 years. That qualifies under county procedure, I believe. Della stared at him. In 4 months of exhaustion and worry and driving and asking and being turned away, no one had offered her anything this direct or this practical. She felt something move through her that was dangerously close to relief, and she did not trust it immediately. You don't know me, she said. I can see you're who you say you are, he replied simply. The deed, the death certificate, those are the proof. My name on the affidavit just says I witnessed your identity, not that I personally vouched for every detail. And you've got your first witness already. I'd just be completing what's needed. She looked at him for another moment. In 1878 in Calhoun County, Texas, you made judgments about people quickly because you had to. She had been making such judgments her whole adult life, and she had been wrong about people before but not often. And the particular quality she was looking for, the kind of steadiness that does not come from calculation but from character, was something she thought she could see in a person's face if she looked for it. She found it in his. All right, she said. Thank you. She placed the affidavit on the counter and smoothed it out. He took the pen from the inkwell on the counter without asking Pratt's permission, bent over the document, and signed his name to the second witness line in a clear, unhurried hand. Louis Abbott. The name sat on the paper in dark ink, steady and certain. He set the pen down and slid the affidavit across the counter to her. Della picked it up. She looked at the signature. Then she assembled her documents: deed, death certificate, affidavit with both signatures now, and placed them squarely on the counter's surface and called with a voice that carried from one end of the room to the other, Mr. Pratt. Vernon Pratt came back to the counter. He looked at the documents. He looked at the 2 witness signatures. He looked at Louis Abbott. There was a long pause in which Pratt appeared to be sorting through his remaining options and finding them limited. Then he took the documents, turned to his desk, and began to process the filing. Della breathed out. Just once, just quietly, but she breathed out. Beside her, Abbott leaned against the counter with his hat still held against his chest, watching Pratt work. And he did not say anything and did not look at her, and somehow that was exactly the right thing to do, to give her the dignity of the moment without making a fuss of it. When Pratt had finished processing the filing and stamped the documents and slid the official receipt across to Della, he did so without looking at her face. She took the receipt, folded it carefully, and placed it inside her coat alongside the deed. She turned to Abbott. I owe you a great deal, she said. You don't owe me anything, he said. It was the right thing. That was all. It should have been all. Della should have said thank you again, gathered herself, and walked out into the April morning with her filed deed and her small victory, and driven home to Eli and her 40 acres and her irrigation problem and the 1,000 other demands that waited for her daily attention. Instead, she said, I don't know your name beyond what I saw on that paper. I'm Della Bancroft. Louis Abbott, he said, confirming it. He put out his hand and she shook it, which was not the universal custom between men and women in 1878, but which felt natural in the moment, because this had been a practical situation and he had handled it practically, and there was no reason to be precious about a handshake. His hand was warm and calloused and held hers for exactly the right amount of time, firm, brief, respectful. Where is your land? He asked. South of the Hendricks Road, she said. Along Redemption Creek, the western branch, the Bancroft place, he nodded once. I ride past there sometimes, heading out to the eastern range. "You're a cowhand, ranch hand," he said. "I work for Daniel Hart, out on the Hart spread east of town, but I've been saving." He said the last part without particular weight, just a statement of fact, as if he was not trying to impress her with it, but it was relevant information that the conversation had earned. "Saving toward land," she said. "Yes," he said. They stood there in the county clerk's office for a moment longer than the situation strictly required, and then Della thanked him once more and walked out into the April morning, with the receipt for her filed deed pressed against her heart, and the sun coming through the limestone buildings of Redemption Creek, and hitting her face like a promise of something she had not thought to expect. She did not look back, but she was aware of the door behind her for much longer than she would have thought reasonable. The drive home was 15 miles of mesquite and pale grass, and the wide Texas sky doing what it always did, which was remind you how small you were without making you feel bad about it. Della drove with the reins in her hands and her thoughts moving around the events of the morning, the way water moves around stones in a stream going where it wants to go, finding the easiest path. She thought about Vernon Pratt's laugh and the hot flush it had produced in her chest, and she was satisfied with how she had handled it. She thought about the deed receipt now tucked safely inside her coat, and she felt the quiet, specific satisfaction of a task completed against resistance. She thought about Calder Beaumont and his interest in her irrigation easement, and she reminded herself that she now had the legal standing to protect it. And she thought about Louis Abbott, not for long. She was a practical woman and she had a great deal to do. But she thought about him, the warmth of his voice, the unhesitating way he had picked up that pen, the amber brown of his eyes in the courthouse light. She thought about him the way you think about an unexpected kindness, trying to understand where it came from and what it means, turning it over in your hands the way you might turn over a stone you found by the creek that was unexpectedly beautiful. She arrived home to find Eli waiting on the porch step, with a smear of dirt on his face that suggested Agnes Purdy's instruction about the vegetable patch had been approximately followed rather than precisely obeyed. He looked up at her with the question in his eyes that he always had when she came back from something important, the look that said, "Did it work? Is it all right? Are we all right?" "It's done," she said. "The deed is filed." Eli let out a breath. He was 8, but he understood property in the way that children raised on a working homestead understood it, not as an abstraction but as the thing that kept the roof over your head and food on the table and a shape to your days. "Good," he said, with the brief, serious satisfaction of someone much older than himself. She ruffled his hair and went inside to put water on for coffee and begin sorting through what still needed doing before nightfall. Louis Abbott spent that afternoon on the eastern range of the Hart spread, riding fence line and checking posts the April rains had softened, and he thought about Della Bancroft more than the fence line strictly required. He had a habit, which Daniel Hart had told him with some affection was his worst quality, of turning things over in his mind until he understood them fully before setting them down. He was doing that now. He had not signed that affidavit out of chivalry exactly, or not only that. He had seen her face, the careful, controlled stillness of a woman working very hard not to show how much was riding on this, and something had simply moved in him. Not pity. He was clear about that with himself. Not pity, because there was nothing diminishing about Della Bancroft's situation. She had walked into that office with everything she needed except one line on a paper, and she had been prepared to fight for it with her own knowledge of Texas law, which had impressed him considerably. He had signed because it was the right thing to do, and because he was the kind of man who tried to do the right thing when the situation was unambiguous, and this situation had been about as unambiguous as it got. But that did not entirely explain why he was still thinking about the color of her eyes in the courthouse light. Louis Abbott was 32 years old. He had come to Calhoun County 3 years ago from Oklahoma Territory, where he had spent 6 years as a working ranch hand after leaving his family's failed farm in Missouri when he was 23. He had not left Missouri in anger. His parents were good people, and he loved them. But in the way that a young man leaves when the land his family owns cannot sustain another generation on it, when the most loving thing he can do is go and not be one more mouth. He had gone west and worked and saved and ridden and worked some more, and now at 32 he had $840 in a bank in Abilene, and the particular patient ambition of a man who knows what he wants and has decided to earn it properly. What he wanted was land of his own, a place where he could put his hands to the soil and know that what he built was his and would remain his. He had not thought much beyond that, because when you are a ranch hand saving toward your first land purchase, thinking beyond that feels presumptuous. But he was close now. 6 months, maybe 8, and he would have enough to put a serious offer on one of the smaller parcels that occasionally came available in Calhoun County. He had not, in 3 years in Redemption Creek, spent much time in what anyone would call social pursuits. He went to town when necessary. He attended church on the occasional Sunday when the ride was not too long after a hard week. He was known at the general store and at the feed and at the livery stable as a quiet man who paid his debts and kept his word. He had not courted anyone, and no one had courted him, and this had not especially bothered him because he had been focused, and because focusing had left little room. But Della Bancroft's face followed him down the fence line through the April afternoon and into the evening, and when he sat by the cookfire that night eating beans and thinking about what there was to think about, he found himself returning to it in a way that told him something had shifted in his interior landscape without his quite deciding to let it. The next time he saw her was 10 days later, and it was not at all a planned encounter. He was riding the Hendricks Road back from Redemption Creek, with a week's worth of supplies packed into his saddlebags. He had been sent for nails and coil wire by Daniel Hart, who trusted Louis for such errands because Louis never forgot anything on the list and did not linger in town to spend someone else's time in conversation. He was moving at a steady pace through the late afternoon when he saw the wagon stopped at the side of the road, and the bay mare standing calmly, and a woman crouched beside the rear left wheel with her sleeves rolled up and her hat pushed back, and a look on her face that was identical in its controlled determination to the look she had worn in the county clerk's office. He pulled up. "Mrs. Bancroft." She looked up, and something in her expression shifted, not the relief of a woman who needed rescuing, but the recognition of a face that was welcome in the vicinity. "Mr. Abbott," she said, "the wheel pin has come loose. I've got the replacement in the wagon bed, but I can't get the old one out with the weight on it. I was about to put a rock under the axle." He swung down from his horse. "That'll work," he said, looking at the situation. "Or I can hold the axle up while you pull the pin. Might be quicker." They did it together, him crouching at the axle and lifting while she worked the loose pin free and slid the new one into place, and seated it with 2 taps of a small hammer she produced from somewhere in the wagon with the efficiency of a woman who kept tools within easy reach of practical problems. The whole thing took less than 4 minutes. "Thank you," she said, rolling her sleeves back down. "You had it handled," he said, which was the truth and which she heard as the truth. They stood by the road for a moment with the late afternoon light coming golden through the mesquite. He was aware of how different she looked out here from how she had looked in the courthouse, less controlled, not because she was distressed, but because she was on her own territory. Her hat was sitting crookedly on her pinned hair, and there was a smear of axle grease on her left forearm, and she looked, he thought, considerably more like herself than anyone he could remember seeing in some time. "How is the deed holding up?" he asked. She smiled, and it was the first time he had seen her smile, and it changed her face entirely, not softened it, exactly, but opened it, the way a window opens a room. "The deed is holding up very well, thank you. Calder Beaumont sent a letter last week informing me of his interest in the irrigation easement. I wrote back explaining that the easement is covered under the terms of the original filing, and that I would be happy to discuss the matter with his attorney if he engaged one." I have not heard from him since." Louis made a sound that was somewhere between a laugh and an expression of appreciation. "You've been busy." "I'm always busy," she said, "but it's a different kind of busy now. When Thomas was alive, the busy was about keeping things going. Now it's about keeping things going and also keeping them mine, which is an additional occupation." He looked at her for a moment. "How old is your boy?" "Eli is 8, a pause. "He's a good boy, serious. He misses his father terribly, but he keeps it close. I worry sometimes that he keeps it too close, but I don't know how to tell a child to grieve differently." "Children usually figure out their own way through," Louis said, and then stopped, because he was not a man who offered opinions on things he had limited authority to speak about. Della noticed the stopping. "Do you have children?" she asked. "No," he said. "I'm not married, haven't been." She received this information with a neutral expression that nonetheless registered it. "Well," she said, "if you're ever riding past the South Fork of Redemption Creek and you want a cup of coffee, the offer is open. It's the least I can owe you." "You don't owe me anything," he said, which was what he had said before. "I know that," she said. "That's why I called it an offer and not a debt." He smiled at that. It was a slow smile that started in his eyes before it reached his mouth, and it did something to the quality of his face that Della Bancroft noted and filed away in a part of her mind she was not, strictly speaking, tending to very carefully at this particular stage of her widowhood and her legal battles and her irrigation problems. "I'll take you up on that," he said, "when I'm riding past." He helped her check the rest of the wheel fittings before she drove on, and then he rode east and she drove west, and the Hendricks road lay between them, empty and golden in the fading afternoon. He rode past the South Fork of Redemption Creek 4 days later. He had not planned to do it. Or he had planned to do it in the way that you plan to do things you tell yourself are casual and ordinary, while knowing, somewhere below the level of honest admission, that they are neither. He came to the homestead on a Thursday afternoon, when the light was still high enough to be useful. The place was a quarter-mile off the main road down a rutted track bordered by scrubby live oaks that were just coming into their spring green. The house was a solidly built frame structure, not large but well-maintained, the kind of house that a person keeps up because it matters to them, not because anyone is watching. There was a kitchen garden along the south wall, newly turned and planted, and a good-sized barn that was older than the house by the look of it. There were chickens in the yard and a milk cow in a small paddock, and a black dog that came to the fence and barked once, assessed Louis with brief professional suspicion, and decided he was acceptable. Eli was in the yard splitting kindling with a hatchet that was sized for a man's hands, but which he was using with the focused determination of a boy who has decided he is equal to the task. He looked up when Louis came through the gate. "You're the man from the courthouse," Eli said. "I am," Louis said, dismounting and tying his horse to the fence post. "Louis Abbott, Eli Bancroft." The boy looked at him with the direct, evaluating gaze that children sometimes have when they are accustomed to serving as junior judges of their household situation. "My mother said you might come by." "She did. She said a man named Abbott might ride past. She said he was a decent sort." This was delivered with the reporting accuracy of a child who is relaying the exact words and not embellishing them. Louis kept his expression careful. "I'm glad she thinks so." Della came around the corner of the house wiping her hands on her work apron, and she stopped for just a fraction of a second when she saw him, and then she came forward with the even step of a woman who does not allow herself to be visibly flustered by things she had on some level been expecting. "Mr. Abbott," she said. "Mrs. Bancroft, I was riding past." "Come in," she said. The kitchen was warm and smelled of something savory that was simmering at the back of the stove, and she put the coffee on, and they sat at the kitchen table with their elbows on its worn surface, and talked for an hour and a half without either of them noticing how much time was passing. They talked about the land, his observations of the county, her plans for the South Field, the water situation along Redemption Creek, which was good this spring after a wet winter. They talked about the practical realities of running a homestead alone, which she discussed without self-pity but also without minimization, because she was beyond the stage where she felt she needed to pretend it was simple. They talked about Missouri, which it turned out they had both come from different parts, different circumstances, but the same cold winters and the particular smell of its river country, which neither of them had ever been able to fully replicate in their memory of other places. Eli sat at the table for the first 30 minutes eating a piece of cornbread with the quiet intensity of a child who is listening to every word being said by the adults and cataloging it. Then he went outside, and Louis heard him resume the kindling splitting, and the regular sound of it punctuated the conversation like a slow, solid clock. When the light began to go and Louis said he should be riding, Della walked him out to the fence where his horse waited. "Thank you for coming," she said. "Eli will sleep better tonight, I think, having seen that the world still contains decent people." "He seems like a boy who's been carrying things," Louis said. "He has. He was very close to Thomas." She said it without the quaver that the words might have carried in a different woman, but with a weight that was entirely honest. "I keep thinking there should be something I can say to him that would help, but I'm beginning to think there isn't anything. That there's just time and working and the gradual understanding that the ground is still solid under you even when someone you love is gone." Louis looked at her. "For what it's worth," he said quietly, "that's what got me through losing my brother. About 8 years ago, there wasn't anything anyone said that helped, but the ground was there every morning." Della looked up at him with an expression that had nothing careful or controlled in it, just a moment of unmediated recognition. Then it settled back into the quieter register that was her usual public face. "Good night, Mr. Abbott," she said. "Good night, Mrs. Bancroft." He rode home along the Hendricks Road in the last light of the April evening, and he held his face up into the wind that was coming out of the south, carrying the smell of the creek and the new grass, and he thought that whatever was happening here was something that called for patience and respect, and the same kind of careful, consistent effort that good land rewarded. The weeks that followed had a rhythm to them that developed the way rhythms do on the frontier, not through deliberate arrangement, but through the accumulated pattern of actions that come naturally and then keep coming. Louis rode past the South Fork of Redemption Creek more regularly than his route strictly required. He began doing it on Sundays, when he had his day to himself, because Sunday was also the day that Della seemed to allow herself the smallest degree of rest, a morning where she might sit on the porch with her coffee and her thoughts before the afternoon work began. They had long conversations on that porch. About the sky, which deserved conversation because it was extraordinary. About the nature of land ownership and the particular satisfaction of knowing a piece of earth intimately, the way you know a person you have spent years alongside. About the books she had somehow acquired and kept. There were 6 of them on a shelf in the kitchen, a small library that she treated with the care you give to luxuries when you have few of them. About music, because it turned out Louis had played fiddle before the workmaid that, impractical, and Della had an old upright piano that Thomas had hauled all the way from Missouri, and that needed tuning but still worked. He came one Sunday with a fiddle he had borrowed from a man at the Heart Spread named Old Corbin, who played it at bunkhouse gatherings, and he played the 3 tunes he still remembered, while Della picked out the melody on the piano by ear, and Eli sat on the floor with the black dog and watched them with an expression that was, for the first time in months, simply happy. Calder Beaumont came calling in May. He was a large man in his 50s with land that bordered the western edge of Della's property, and an attitude toward neighboring land that was not so much aggressive, as it was acquisitive in the patient, waiting way of a man who expects that eventually circumstances will deliver him what he wants without his needing to take it by force. He arrived on a Monday morning when Louis was not there, which may or may not have been intentional, riding up to the house with 2 of his hired men at a respectful but pointed distance. He sat his horse in the yard and asked Della, with the particular courtesy that is a form of condescension, how she was managing on her own, whether she had considered selling the parcel now that she was without a husband to work it, and whether she knew that a woman running 40 acres alone was, in his view, a situation that was hard on everybody, most especially the child. Della listened to all of this from the porch steps. She had a garden fork in her hand which she had been using when he arrived, and she kept it in her hand throughout the conversation. "Mr. Beaumont," she said when he finished, "the land is not for sale. The deed is filed in my name, as I expect you know, since you appear well informed about my affairs. The irrigation easement along the South Creek boundary is protected by the original filing. If you have a legal dispute with any of these facts, you are welcome to take it up with the county court. I will see you there." Beaumont looked down at her from his horse with the expression of a man reassessing something. Then he looked at the garden fork. Then he looked at her face. "You're a capable woman," he said, which was not a compliment exactly but was an acknowledgement. "I'm a landowner," Della said, "in Calhoun County. Good morning, Mr. Beaumont." He rode away. When Louis heard about it, she told him the following Sunday, in the matter-of-fact way she described practical obstacles. His jaw tightened in a way that told her something about how he felt about it, even though he was careful with what he said. "Do you think he'll push further?" he asked. "He might," she said, "but he's a man who takes paths of least resistance when given an alternative. I gave him one." She paused. "I told him the deed was filed and the easement protected. Both of those things are true because of what happened at the courthouse." Louis looked at her. "You would have found a way. I would have found a harder way," she said. "There's a difference." He looked out at the creek, visible from the porch as a dark line of cottonwoods in the distance. Then he looked at her again, and the quality of his looking was different from how it had been in April, less careful, more direct, something in it that he was no longer fully managing. "Della," he said, and it was the first time he had used her first name. She looked at him. "I would like to come here not just on Sundays," he said. "I would like to be more present in what's happening here. If that is agreeable to you." He stopped himself from saying more than that, because he was a man who believed in saying the right amount and not more, but his eyes said the rest of it and she could read it. Della turned this over for a moment in the way she turned things over, not quickly but honestly, going through it as though examining a document for clauses she might have missed. "Yes," she said, "that's agreeable to me." He came more often after that. He helped with the fence that the spring floods had damaged along the north boundary. He rode with Eli one afternoon to the far corner of the property and taught him to read the land to see where water would move, where soil was good and where it was thin, where a fence post would hold and where the ground would refuse it. Eli received this instruction with the seriousness he gave to everything, and he also, gradually, began to smile more. Della watched this from a measured distance and felt something shift in her with the particular complexity of a widow who loves her child above everything and recognizes that what is good for the child is also something she cannot let make her decisions for her. She needed to know what she felt on her own terms, not on Eli's behalf. She was honest enough about herself to understand this. What she felt on her own terms was this: Louis Abbott was the kind of man she had not known she was missing, because she had been too busy surviving to notice the absence. He was steady in the way that Thomas had been steady, but with a quality additionally, a way of seeing her, specifically her, that Thomas in his good-hearted and limited way had not quite managed. Thomas had loved her but had sometimes loved a version of her that was a few degrees off from who she actually was. Louis seemed to see the actual Della Bancroft, the stubborn, competent, occasionally sharp-tongued, privately tender, deeply tired and deeply strong person that she was, and to find that person, specifically that person, worth his sustained attention. She found this alarming and wonderful in roughly equal parts. One evening in late June, Louis stayed past supper. Eli had asked him to stay, with the direct simplicity of a child who knows what he wants and sees no reason not to ask for it. And after Eli went to bed they sat on the porch in the warm night with the sound of the creek frogs coming from the distance, and the stars doing the extraordinary thing they do in a Texas summer night, which is to crowd together so thickly in a sky so clear that you feel the planet turning beneath you. "Tell me about Missouri," Della said. She was sitting in the other porch chair with her coffee cup held in both hands, her feet up on the porch rail, looking at the stars. "Which part?" he said. "The part you miss." He thought about it honestly. "The way the river smelled in the morning," he said, "before anyone was up, when you were a boy and you were the first one outside and the whole world was still quiet and you had the river smell and the mist and the feeling that the day was entirely yours before anyone else put a claim on it." She was quiet for a moment. "I miss the spring mud," she said. "I know that sounds strange, but in Missouri the spring mud was different. It was black, deep black, and it smelled like everything growing at once. Here the soil is red and the mud when it comes is clay mud. It's fine, but it isn't the same smell." "No," he agreed, "it isn't." They sat with that for a while, which was something they had gotten comfortable with. The silences between them were not empty. They had the quality of silences between people who have a great deal to think about and have found someone they can think about it alongside. "Louis," she said. "Yes." She turned and looked at him. He turned and looked at her. The lamplight from the window was behind her, and the starlight was from everywhere above, and she was very clearly in this light and in this moment, the woman she was, all of her, without armor, without the controlled face she wore into courthouses and confrontations. "I don't know how to do this," she said. "I want to be honest about that. I was married at 20. I have been widowed at 29. I don't know what I'm doing with what I feel when I look at you." He was quiet for a moment. "I don't know that it requires knowing," he said. "Not yet. But I need to be fair to you," she said. "I have Eli. I have 40 acres that are mine in law but which I fight for every season. I have neighbors who would rather I sold and went east. I am not a simple situation." "I don't want a simple situation," he said. "I'm 32 and I've had simple situations. Simple situations are quiet and they don't ask anything of you and they leave you in the same place you started." She looked at him. "What are you saying?" He set down his coffee cup. He turned to face her fully, and his expression was the most unguarded she had ever seen it, the steady, patient care of it fully visible now, not held back. "I'm saying that I have been riding past this farm on Sundays since April because I wanted to see you," he said. "Not the farm, although the farm is fine land. You. I'm saying that the morning in the courthouse I signed that paper because it was right. And then I spent the whole afternoon on a fence line thinking about your eyes, which was not what I expected to spend the afternoon doing. I'm saying that Eli is a fine boy and that I would be honored to know him better. I'm saying all of that so that you know where I am standing, not so that you have to say anything back right now." Della looked at him for a long time. The frogs were loud along the creek. Somewhere down the road a coyote made its thin, high sound once and stopped. She reached across the space between their chairs and put her hand on top of his where it rested on the arm of the chair, and she held it there, and he turned his hand over under hers and held on, and that was all that happened that evening, which was also everything. They did not rush. It was not in either of their natures to rush, and the country they lived in had taught them both that things built in a hurry fall down in a hurry. They were careful with each other through the rest of that summer in the way that people are careful when they know that what they are building matters, and that care is not distance, but the opposite of it. Care is attention, sustained and honest, and it is one of the most intimate things people can offer each other. Louis asked Daniel Hart in August for a reduction in his working days, from 6 to 5, so that he could spend Saturdays as well as Sundays at the Bancroft place. Hart, who was a shrewd man and a good employer, looked at him over the brim of his coffee cup and said, "This is about the widow on the creek road," and Louis said, "Yes," and Hart said, "She's got good land," and Louis said, "She's got a good deal more than good land," and Hart said, "Take your Saturdays," and that was the end of it. On Saturdays and Sundays, Louis worked the farm alongside Della. They worked in the particular harmony that develops between people who understand physical labor and who communicate through the language of it, knowing when to hand a tool before being asked, knowing when to step back and let the other person solve a problem because they need to know they can solve it, knowing how to work in proximity without colliding. Eli worked alongside them whenever the work was not too heavy for him, and often when it was he tried anyway, and Louis had learned to let him try and then step in at the exact moment where assistance became necessity rather than intrusion. In the evenings they ate together, and after Eli went to bed they sat on the porch or at the kitchen table, and they talked and sometimes were quiet, and on 3 occasions they played music together. Louis on old Corbin's borrowed fiddle, which he had come to use with increasing frequency, and which old Corbin had eventually pressed him to simply keep, and Della on the piano, which Louis had spent one September morning tuning with the tuning key he had bought in Abilene specifically for the purpose. The first time he kissed her, it was a September evening after the music, and Eli was in bed, and they were standing by the door where he was saying good night as he always did, and she was standing in the lamplight with a small smile still on her face from the last tune they had played, and he looked at her and she looked at him and he said, "May I?" Very quietly, and she said, "Yes," just as quietly, and he kissed her once briefly with the contained tenderness of a man who has a great deal more feeling than he is offering in a single first kiss, but who understands that a first kiss should say only what it has the right to say. Then he left and rode home in the warm September night with the stars overhead and the mesquite smell in the air, and his heart doing something it had not done in a very long time, which was to feel entirely, uncomplainingly full. Della stood at the door after he rode away and pressed one hand to her cheek and laughed, softly, once, not at anything funny, but at the particular absurdity of being 29 years old and a widow and a landowner and a person with irrigation disputes and a dead husband's ghost in every corner of the house she lived in, and still feeling exactly like this. October came with a blue sky and a cooling wind and the cottonwoods along the creek going gold, and with it came the season's last major piece of outstanding business. Calder Beaumont had engaged an attorney after all, not the county attorney, but a man from Abilene named Price, who handled property disputes throughout the region, and who had a reputation for being effective and expensive. Price filed a motion in Calhoun County Court disputing the irrigation easement attached to the Bancroft deed, claiming on behalf of Beaumont that the easement had been voided by the change of title, that when the deed transferred from Thomas Bancroft to Della Bancroft, the specific language of the easement clause created an ambiguity about whether it ran with the land or with the original title holder. This was not entirely frivolous as a legal argument. It was not strong, but it was not nothing. Della received the notice with the particular stillness she brought to bad news, and then drove to Redemption Creek to see Gerald Hicks. Hicks read the motion. He charged her for the hour he spent reading it, and then looked over his spectacles at her, and said that she needed to respond, and that the response needed to cite the original language of the easement clause and a couple of specific Texas Supreme Court decisions about easements appurtenant, and that he could draft this response for her for $12. She did not have $12 easily available in the middle of October, which was after harvest expenses and before winter settlement. She told Louis about it that Saturday. She told him without drama and without the implication that she was asking for anything, because she was not asking for anything except that he know about it, because she had reached the point where keeping things from him felt dishonest. He listened, and then he said without preamble, "I have the money. Let me help." She shook her head. "No, Della, Louis." She said his name firmly but not unkindly. "I will not have the handling of my land financed by a man I am not married to. Not because of what it looks like to other people, but because of what it would mean to how I hold this land. It has to be mine all the way down." He sat with this. He understood it more than he could easily have explained, because it was the same reason he had spent 9 years saving instead of asking his parents or his employer for a loan. Some things have to be earned cleanly, or they are not entirely yours. "All right," he said. "Then let me help you draft the response without hicks. I can't cite case law, but I can read the original deed language and help you write the argument. Save you the $12. She looked at him. "Do you know how to do that?" "I know how to read a legal document, and I know how to write plainly," he said. "I worked for a year in an Abilene surveying office before I came to Hart's. I have read more easement clauses than most people in this county." She thought about this. "That is not the same as legal drafting." "No," he agreed, "but you already know the law better than Vernon Pratt expected you to, and you understand your own deed. We can put together something that will at minimum require Price to actually argue his case instead of relying on Beaumont's position going unopposed. And if the court needs more, you can hire Hicks at that point." She considered it for a long moment. "Then all right." They spent 3 evenings that week at the kitchen table with the deed and the notice and a copy of the Texas general laws that Louis rode to Abilene to obtain from the county law library. And they worked through the language together, Della writing and Louis reading over her shoulder and suggesting adjustments. And what they produced was not elegant legal prose, but was a clear, factually grounded, precisely argued response that cited the deed language, demonstrating the easement was appurtenant to the land and not personal to the original title holder. Gerald Hicks, when Della showed him the draft before filing, she paid him 50 cents for 15 minutes, which was all the consultation she needed, blinked at it several times, and said it was adequate and that she should probably add one additional citation, which he gave her for the 50 cents. She filed the response herself at the county clerk's window. Vernon Pratt was behind the counter. He saw her coming, and his expression underwent the particular adjustments of a man who has made an error once and is not certain how many times the consequences of it will keep appearing. He took her response, stamped it, filed it, and gave her the receipt without comment, without the theatrical scrutiny, without the laugh. The court took the matter up in November, and after a brief hearing at which Della appeared without an attorney and presented her argument in her own voice with her documentation in hand, found entirely in her favor. The easement was confirmed appurtenant to the land. Calder Beaumont's motion was dismissed. Price's fee was, presumably, the only thing Beaumont had to show for it. Della walked out of that courthouse on a cold November morning with the judgment receipt in her hand and Louis waiting at the bottom of the courthouse steps, because she had told him the hearing date and he had appeared without being asked, standing with his hat in his hands in the wind. She came down the steps and stopped in front of him. "It's done," she said. He put out his hand. She looked at it, and then she did something she had not done in a courthouse since the morning in April. She stepped forward and put her arms around him, and he put his arms around her, and they stood there on the courthouse steps of Redemption Creek in the cold November wind, while a few citizens of the town went about their business around them, and Della's face was pressed against Louis's shoulder, and she breathed him in, the smell of cold air and leather and the particular steadiness of him, and felt for the first time since Thomas died that the world was not just survivable but good. He held her. He held her with care and with the warmth of a man who is holding something he values absolutely, and he did not say anything because there was nothing to say that the holding did not already say. When she stepped back, her eyes were bright, though she would have denied what it meant. "Eli wanted me to ask you something," she said, composing herself with admirable speed. "What did Eli want you to ask me?" "He wanted to know if you would stay for Christmas." Louis looked at her. There was a question inside the question, and they both knew it. "Not just Christmas," he said quietly. She looked back at him. The wind moved her hair, pulling a strand free from its pin. She did not push it back. "No," she said, "not just Christmas." He asked her father in mid-December. Or rather, he wrote to her father in Missouri, a man named George Whitmore who had retired from farming and lived with Della's mother in the town of Carthage, because her father was 3 days' ride away, and the propriety of the matter required that he write, and Louis Abbott was a man who understood propriety in the specific way that someone who has seen enough of its absence knows why it matters. He wrote that he was a ranch hand of 32 years, with substantial savings and serious intentions of acquiring land of his own in Calhoun County, that he had known Mrs. Della Bancroft for 8 months, that he held her in the highest possible regard, that her son Eli was a fine boy who he intended to treat as his own, and that he was requesting Whitmore's blessing for a formal courtship with the intention of marriage, which was perhaps old-fashioned for the frontier, but which felt right to write. George Whitmore wrote back in 11 days, which was about as fast as a letter could travel from Carthage to Redemption Creek in 1878. He wrote that he appreciated the letter and its directness, that he had heard from Della about Louis Abbott and about the courthouse matter, that any man who signed a legal document to help a widow he did not know, and then spent 8 months helping her run her farm and fight her legal battles, was a man whose character he was inclined to trust, and that he gave his blessing with full sincerity, and the hope that Louis would bring Della east to visit when circumstances allowed. Della received this information from Louis one evening in late December when the fire was going in the kitchen and Eli was in bed, and the windows were frosted from the first real cold of the season. Louis had the letter from her father, and he folded it and put it in his coat pocket and then said, without excessive ceremony, "Della, I would like to marry you if you'll have me." She was standing at the stove with her back to him when he said it. She turned around. "I talked to Eli," she said. "What did he say?" "He said," she paused, and there was the brightness in her eyes again. "He said that you knew which corner post was bad before he did, and that anybody who could do that was probably all right." Louis's expression went through several things at once. "He said one other thing," Della said. "What did he say?" "He said he thought maybe you could teach him to play the fiddle." Louis looked at her, she looked at him. "Is that a yes?" he said. "Yes, Louis," she said. "That is a yes." He crossed the kitchen in 3 steps and she met him halfway, and when he kissed her, it was not the careful, restrained kiss of September but the full thing, with all the patience and feeling and care that 9 months had accumulated. And she kissed him back in the same way, and the fire popped in the stove and the frost thickened on the windows, and somewhere in the house Eli, who was not entirely asleep, smiled into his pillow. They were married in February of 1879, on a Saturday morning at the small Baptist church in Redemption Creek, which had just been painted white and looked clean and simple and honest against a pale winter sky. Agnes Purdy was there, small and fierce in her church dress, and Daniel Hart was there with his wife, and old Corbin was there with his fiddle. Eli stood next to Louis at the front of the church, dressed in his good clothes with his hair wetted flat and his chin up, fulfilling the role of best man with the gravity and attention of someone who has decided this is the most important job he has held in his 8 years and 3 months of life. The minister read the words and Louis said them back clearly and without hesitation, and Della said them back clearly and without hesitation, and they looked at each other while they said them with the directness of 2 people who are not performing a ceremony but making an actual promise. After the wedding, they drove back to the farm, which was the Bancroft farm and would continue to be called that, because names on land have meaning, and Della had fought too hard for that name to change it. And old Corbin played, and Agnes made the cake, and Daniel Hart made a toast that was brief and sincere and made Della laugh. And Eli ate a considerable amount of cake and fell asleep in his chair late in the afternoon with the black dog beside him. And outside, the February sky was very blue, and the cottonwoods along the creek were bare and silver, and the land was quiet and entirely theirs. In April of 1879, Louis Abbott filed his first land purchase. He had been saving for 9 years, and he had $840, and the land office in Abilene had an adjacent parcel of 22 acres immediately south of the Bancroft property that had reverted to the county for unpaid taxes. He rode to Abilene with the money, filed the purchase, and drove home through the spring afternoon with the deed in his coat pocket and the feeling in his chest that you only feel once in your life, when the thing you have been working toward for 9 years is finally exactly as real as the ground under your horse's feet. He told Della when he got home. She had been in the kitchen garden with Eli, who was planting squash seeds in the turned earth with the methodical precision of a boy who has been taught to do things correctly. She came to the fence with her garden gloves still on and listened to him and then looked south, toward where the new parcel began. "That joins our land together," she said. "It does," he said. 62 acres of Redemption Creek bottomland, water access on 3 sides. Della looked at the land for a moment and then she looked at him. "You are a very good man, Louis Abbott," she said. "I had good reasons to save," he said. She laughed, which was a sound he was still not entirely used to hearing, and which still did the same thing to him it always had. The spring of 1879 was a good one. The winter had been wet enough to fill the creek and the cisterns, and the soil was ready for what you put in it, and the 62 acres of the combined Bancroft Abbott holding were the best they had been since the land was broken. Louis learned the full rhythm of the farm, not as a helper or a visitor but as a partner in it, which was a different thing. He brought knowledge from his years with Hart and from the surveying work, and from 9 years of looking at other men's land and understanding what they did well and what they did wrong. Della brought 30 years of life and 2 years of fighting to keep what was hers, and the particular sharpness of a woman who had been compelled by circumstance to understand everything about her situation fully, and the two of them together were, as Agnes Purdy said with the bluntness that was her primary characteristic, about the most capable pair of people this end of the county has produced. Eli turned 9 in May and grew a full inch over the summer and began his fiddle lessons with Louis on Tuesday evenings, approaching the instrument with the same seriousness he brought to everything and producing, at first, sounds that made the black dog leave the room, and then gradually sounds that were not unpleasant, and then by autumn sounds that were sometimes almost music. In August, Della told Louis she was expecting. She told him in the morning, before the day's work began, sitting at the kitchen table with her coffee, because she was a woman who delivered important information plainly and did not wait for elaborate moments. She said she was certain she was about 2 months along and she was feeling well. Louis looked at her across the table. His expression went through something large and quiet, the way weather moves across a landscape. You can see the whole of it in the sky even when the rain has not yet fallen. He put his hand across the table and she took it. "Are you happy?" she asked. "Della," he said, "I am so far past happy that I don't know the name of where I am." She smiled. "Good," she said. "Now eat your breakfast." The pregnancy was straightforward. Della was healthy and determined and worked the farm at full capacity until October, when Louis, with some careful diplomacy, arranged for the heavier tasks to be taken over by himself, and a hired hand he brought on for the season. A young man named Will, 19 and serious, and in need of steady work, whom Eli immediately adopted as a kind of auxiliary older brother. On a cold night in late February of 1880, in the same house where she had spent 4 months of widowhood surviving the worst winter of her life, Della Abbott gave birth to a son. Agnes Purdy served as midwife, as she had for half the women in this part of Calhoun County for the past decade, and Louis sat outside the bedroom door for 4 hours with his hat in his hands and his eyes closed and his lips moving slightly, which was as close as he usually came to prayer, but which on this occasion went further. When Agnes opened the door and told him to come in, he stood up and went in and saw Della lying back against the pillows with the baby in her arms, and she looked at him with exhausted, absolute clarity, all of her, entirely present, entirely there, and she said, "Come and meet your son." He sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the baby, who was very new and very pink and was making the small sound that new people make when they have just arrived in a world that is noisier and colder and more enormous than whatever they came from. "Eli is going to want to name him something impractical," Della said. "What does Eli want to name him?" "Lightning," she said. Louis looked at the baby. The baby opened one dark eye briefly and closed it. "His name is James," Della said. "For Thomas's middle name, I want him to have something of his father in this house." Louis looked at her. "That's exactly right," he said. James Thomas Abbott came into the world in Calhoun County, Texas, on a February night in 1880, with 62 acres waiting for him along the western branch of Redemption Creek and an older brother who had already decided, when informed that morning that the name would not be Lightning, that he would teach the baby everything he knew regardless. The spring that followed was the fullest they had known. The land was good and getting better. Louis had put a second well in the north field the previous autumn, and the irrigation from the creek easement, the easement that had been fought over and confirmed by a Calhoun County court, fed the south field so thoroughly that the summer squash alone paid 2 months of farm expenses. Will stayed on through spring, and they took him on permanently at a wage he could live on, and with the promise of a small corner parcel lease after 5 years if the arrangement continued to suit everyone, because Louis believed in the kind of arrangement that gave a working man a future to walk toward. Eli, at 9 going on 40, decided that he was going to raise cattle when he was grown, because he had talked at some length with Daniel Hart at a town gathering, and had come away with the conviction that cattle were the future of this part of Texas. And Eli Bancroft did not arrive at convictions casually. He told Louis about this plan with the seriousness of a business presentation, and Louis listened to the whole thing with full attention, and then said that if Eli intended to run cattle, he ought to start learning the land patterns of the eastern range. And on the following Saturday he took Eli out to ride the full perimeter of the combined holding, and explained what he saw and why he saw it, and asked Eli what he saw in return. Eli saw a great deal. Louis was not surprised. Della, watching them ride out together from the porch with James asleep against her shoulder, felt something she did not immediately name because she was a woman who came to things honestly and in their own time. When it arrived at its name, it was this: wholeness. Not the completion of something missing, but the wholeness of something that had been allowed to grow into its full and proper shape. Thomas had been her first love and the father of her first child and the man who had brought her to this land, and his death had been a violence done to her life that she would not pretend was anything other than that. She had grieved him fully, and she would continue to carry that grief in the particular private way that losses of that magnitude are carried, not foregrounded, not displayed but present, a stone in the pocket of everything. But grief and love are not competing claims. She had learned this slowly and then all at once, in the way that you learn the important things. You do not love someone less by loving someone else. You do not honor what you had by refusing what is offered. Thomas would have wanted her to stay on this land and keep it and raise Eli and live fully, because he had been a good man, and good men want the people they love to live. She pressed her cheek against James's warm head, and looked at the cottonwoods along the creek going green again, the third spring since Louis had walked into the county clerk's office to file a tax receipt, and signed his name to a line on a paper that had no calculation in it at all, just decency, just the right thing. And she thought that the chain of events by which a life moves from one place to another is so small and so specific and so contingent on moments you almost miss that you have to pay attention. You have to be watching or you will miss the whole of it. She had been watching. She was glad. In May of 1880, Redemption Creek had its first real festival, a spring celebration organized by the Methodist and Baptist churches jointly, which said something about the growth of the community, because a year earlier neither congregation had been large enough to organize much of anything. There were tables set up on the main street, and food contributed from every family in the county, and there was music, and there were foot races that Eli entered and lost with complete equanimity, and there was a pie competition that Agnes Purdy won with a blueberry pie, and the competitive intensity of someone who had been waiting 11 years for the opportunity to win it publicly. Louis played the fiddle at the festival, along with old Corbin and two other men, and the music went on for 3 hours while the afternoon light went gold, and the people of Redemption Creek danced in the street, and the children ran between the tables, and everything had the quality, briefly, of a world in which the ordinary difficulties and injustices, and they were real and they continued, because a festival does not end the ways in which the world is arranged against women trying to hold land, against people without connections trying to access what is legally theirs, but in which those difficulties were temporarily balanced by the fact that people could also do this, could also come together in a street and play music and eat pie and watch their children run. Della danced with Louis to a waltz that old Corbin played with his eyes closed, and his bow arm moving in the particular way of someone who knows a piece completely, and is no longer playing it so much as inhabiting it. Louis held her hand and her waist with the same combination of steadiness and warmth that he brought to everything, and they moved through the waltz in the street of Redemption Creek in the May evening, while Eli carried James on his hip at the edge of the crowd, and pointed out the dancers to his little brother with the proprietary pride of a 9-year-old who understands that 2 of them are his, entirely his, and always will be. It was a good moment. They had many good moments after that, but this one had a completeness to it that the later ones, for all their joy, could not quite replicate, because it was early enough that the shape of their life together was still being seen for the first time, and there is a particular quality to the first clear sight of a good thing that cannot be manufactured or repeated. That summer, Louis and Della planted the north field entirely in cotton for the first time, which was an ambition Louis had been working toward, and which required the irrigation from the new well and the creek easement both, and which paid, at the end of the season, considerably more than either of them had projected in their most optimistic calculations. They put the money toward a second barn and a new cook stove, and a small addition to the east end of the house that gave Eli his own room, which he required less as a luxury and more as a practical necessity, given the noise James was making at 2 in the morning, with the regularity of someone who considered the night schedule negotiable. Eli turned 10 that autumn, and Louis gave him his own horse, a brown gelding of 4 years that was steady and sensible, and which Eli named, with the naming habits of a boy who had been denied Lightning as a name for his brother, Thundercloud. This was accepted by everyone as a reasonable compromise. The years that followed built on each other the way good years do, not without difficulty, because the frontier in the 1880s was still a place where the ground could refuse you, and the weather could turn against you, and the markets could take what you had built and subtract a season's work from it without apology. There were droughts, and they weathered them. There were price drops, and they adjusted. Calder Beaumont sold his land in 1882 to a family from Tennessee and moved to San Antonio, and the Tennessee family were decent neighbors who had no interest in anyone else's irrigation easements. Will, the hired hand, took his corner lease at 5 years and built a small house on it, and married a woman named Clara from Redemption Creek, and their first child was born in 1883 and was named Louis, which caused a brief confusion that everyone found funny. Agnes Purdy, who was 71 and had the constitution of a woman who had decided that death would have to come and find her because she was not going to make it easy, continued to appear at the Bancroft Abbott farm on Sunday mornings with opinions about the kitchen garden and approval for James, of whom she was ferociously fond. Vernon Pratt retired from the county clerk's position in 1881, replaced by a man named Hal Sutter who was 26 and earnest, and treated every person who came to his counter with the same level of service regardless of who they were, which was all anyone had ever asked of the position. The day Della heard that Pratt had retired, she thought of the courthouse in April of 1878, the sound of his laugh, the deliberate fog of procedural obstruction, the hot flush in her chest that she had refused to let become defeat, and she thought of Louis reaching past her to the inkwell and signing his name to a document he had every right and no obligation to sign. And she felt the particular satisfaction of a woman who has outlasted the forces arrayed against her with her land intact and her name on the deed. James took his first steps at 11 months and said his first clear word at 13 months, which was horse, which Eli considered a personal tribute and Louis considered evidence of character. He grew with the particular robustness of a boy born to working parents who ate well and slept well and had 62 acres of creek bottom Texas to roam in. He followed Louis the way small children follow the people who feel to them like safety. Always 3 steps behind, always watching, always reaching for the nearest large hand when the world was uncertain. He called Louis Papa from the beginning because he had no other word for it, and because Louis was the person who was there in the mornings and the evenings and the nights when he cried, which grew less frequent as he grew less new. And Louis was Papa without qualification, without the need for any ceremony other than the daily practice of it, which is what fatherhood is. Eli had a different relationship with it, as Eli had a different relationship with everything. He called Louis by his first name, which they had settled on by mutual agreement when Eli was 9, not because there was any lack of connection, but because Eli Bancroft was a particular person with a particular father who had been particular to him, and the name was how he kept both truths at once. Louis understood this completely and thought no less of it. On the contrary, he thought it was exactly right, which was how he had come to think of Eli generally, exactly right. Della became pregnant again in the spring of 1882, and this time the pregnancy was more difficult, particularly in the 4th month when she was unwell in a way that kept her from the heavier work, and which Louis managed with a combination of hired additional help and his own expanded capacity, working from before dawn to after dark through that spring without complaint or drama, simply because the farm required it, and so he did it. She delivered a daughter in November of 1882. They named her Clara, which made 2 Claras on the property until the Harts, who had moved 2 miles north, noted the confusion and called their Clara Clary, which she preferred anyway. Clara Abbott arrived in a world that had been thoroughly prepared for her. Eli, 12 and already showing the broad shoulders and considered manner that he would carry his whole life, held her with the cautious reverence of a boy who has been told that babies require gentleness, and who has decided that this baby in particular requires more gentleness than most. James, who was almost 3, looked at her with the expression of a person who has been told a new development is coming, and has been prepared by that information insufficiently. Louis held Clara and looked at her and looked at Della, and did what he had done when James was born. He said very little, because the things worth saying on those occasions are not in the range of words, and he sat on the edge of the bed and held Clara with one hand and held Della's hand with the other, and Della, who was tired with the particular exhaustion of someone who has just done the hardest work there is, looked at him and said, "We are a great deal more than we were." "Yes," he said. "In every direction," she said. "Yes," he agreed. Outside the window, the November sky was the color it gets in Texas in late autumn, a deep, clean blue that has been washed by the summer's heat and the October rains, the color of something that has been through its trials and come out clarified. The cottonwoods along the creek were mostly bare, but the creek itself ran clear and cold, the same creek that had been running along the boundary of the Bancroft land since Thomas brought Della here from Missouri, the same creek whose easement she had fought for and won, the same creek that in spring would feed 62 acres of bottomland, and in summer would cool the air under the cottonwood stand where Eli took his horse on hot afternoons, and where James would soon be following him. The land was theirs. Cleanly, legally, entirely theirs, both names on the deed, both signatures on the title, the whole of it recorded in the county clerk's office of Calhoun County, Texas, in the files that sat behind a long wooden counter where one morning in April of 1878 a woman had been laughed at for daring to file a loan, and where a man she did not know had reached for a pen and written his name, and changed the shape of everything that came after. Redemption Creek was not a large town in 1882. It was growing, which was what Texas was doing, growing with the particular urgency of a place that knew the frontier was closing and was trying to be something before it did. New families came every season. The schoolhouse was expanded. A second general store opened. A telegraph line was laid through to Abilene, and on the day it opened, Della sent a message to her parents in Carthage that said simply, "We are well. Come visit." Her parents arrived the following spring, her father George and her mother Ruth, traveling by rail to Abilene and then by hired coach to Redemption Creek, arriving on a May morning when the land was at its best green along the creek, the cotton field just up, the kitchen garden full of things that were making themselves known. George Whitmore was a quiet man with a white beard and the particular eyes of someone who has spent a life looking at land and learning it. He walked the 62 acres with Louis on the first afternoon, the two of them moving through the north field and the south field and down along the creek, and they talked about soil and water and what you could do with a piece of land if you worked it right and gave it its due respect. George Whitmore, who had spent 30 years farming Missouri bottom ground, recognized a man who understood land the way it deserves to be understood, and he said as much to Ruth that evening, which was the highest form of approval in his vocabulary. Ruth Whitmore, who was a woman of great warmth and the practical intelligence that great warmth is sometimes used to conceal, spent the first morning in the kitchen with Della, and by the end of it, they had covered everything that needed to be covered between a mother and a daughter who live 3 days apart and have not seen each other in 4 years. Then Ruth spent the afternoon with the children and conducted her own assessment, and by the evening she had decided that James was remarkable, that Clara was going to cause everyone some difficulty when she was older in the best possible way, and that Eli Bancroft was an old soul in a 12-year-old's body, and that someone should make sure he had good books. She had brought 6 books with her in her travel case. She gave them to Eli on the second morning with the no-nonsense directness of a woman who knows a reader when she sees one. Eli received them as though they were property deeds. The visit lasted 2 weeks. When George and Ruth left on the southbound coach for Abilene and the train east, Della watched the coach until she could not see it anymore and then turned and found Louis standing behind her, which was where he had been for 4 years, behind her, beside her, in front of her when the fence needed mending or the creek flooded its banks, in the doorway of the kitchen when the evening light came in from the west and everything was quiet. He put his arm around her and she leaned against him, and they stood on the porch of their house in the May morning with the creek running and the land open before them, and the sound of James somewhere in the kitchen with Agnes Purdy, who had arrived as the coaches departed because Agnes Purdy had the scheduling instincts of a woman who has spent decades making herself necessary at exactly the right moments. "Do you ever think about Missouri?" Louis asked. "Sometimes," she said. "Do you?" "Sometimes," he said. But less, she knew what he meant. Less every year, as the Texas sky got more familiar, and the smell of the creek got more ingrained, and the shape of the land got more known. Less like a thing you borrowed and more like a thing that was yours in the deep way. The way the creek was the land's, and the land was the air's, and all of it was connected in the patient, indifferent, magnificent way of a country that was here before you and will be here after you, and asks only that while you are here you work it honestly. They had worked it honestly. In the years that followed, they would continue to. Eli grew into the broad-shouldered, considered man that the boy had promised, and at 20 he bought his first cattle, and by 25 he had a small herd and a lease on the Hart Eastern Range, and was known in Calhoun County as a young man worth watching. James grew into his horse and his father's patience and his mother's sharpness of mind, and went to the Redemption Creek School, until it ran out of things to teach him. And then Louis arranged for him to spend a year in Abilene with a schoolmaster there who could take him further, because Louis Abbott was a man who had taught himself the limits of his own education, and had decided, from that honest reckoning, that his children would not have the same limits if he had anything to say about it. Clara was, as Ruth Whitmore had predicted, a considerable force. By the time she was old enough for the schoolhouse, she had already been negotiating with her brothers for years with the calm effectiveness of a small person who has assessed her situation and found that confidence is the primary currency. She had her mother's jaw and her father's eyes and Agnes Purdy's absolute certainty that she was right about everything, which Agnes Purdy considered the highest compliment she could bestow. The deed to the Bancroft Abbott land was renewed and updated in 1884, at which point it covered the original 40 Bancroft acres, Louis's 22 purchased acres, and an additional 10 that they had bought along the northern boundary when an opportunity came up that was too good to decline. 72 acres in total, running along the creek with good water and good soil, and the cottonwood stand that went gold in October and silver in February and green again in April. Della filed the updated deed herself, as she had filed everything. She walked up to the long wooden counter at the Calhoun County Clerk's office on a June morning in 1884, placed her documents on its surface, and looked at Hal Sutter, who greeted her by name with the straightforward courtesy he extended to everyone, and who processed the filing with the efficiency of a man who takes his job seriously because he understands it to be a service to the public. She took the receipt and folded it and placed it in her coat beside the deed, the same coat pocket where the first receipt had gone 6 years earlier, and she stood in the courthouse for a moment alone. Louis was outside, tending the horses, and she thought about that April morning in 1878, about the laugh, about the hollow space on the affidavit where the second signature belonged, about the door opening behind her and the sound of boots, and the way everything had been about to change without her knowing it. She thought about Louis reaching for that pen. Then she walked out into the June morning. He was at the bottom of the steps with the horses, talking to someone, a young woman who had come to file her own paperwork, and who was asking him something about the procedure. He was explaining it to her with the patient, practical clarity that was one of his primary qualities, pointing at the courthouse door and describing the counter and what documents she would need and what order to present them in. Della came down the steps and stood next to him. The young woman thanked him and went inside. "Old habit," Della said. He looked at her with that slow smile that had started in his eyes first. "Only kind of habit worth having," he said. She took his hand. They walked to the horses and rode home together through the June afternoon on the Hendricks Road, past the live oaks and the mesquite and the pale summer grass, toward the South Fork of Redemption Creek and the 72 acres that were theirs, cleanly and entirely, in the most real way that anything can be yours. Not because you were given it, not because you claimed it by force, but because you fought for it honestly with your own hands and your own knowledge and the kindness of a good man who saw what was right and did it. And all of it together had made something that would last long past the both of them, laid into the ground as surely as the cottonwood roots along the creek, as permanent as anything in this impermanent world. The road ran west and the sky ran wide above them, and the Texas afternoon was very long and very golden and very much, in every way that mattered, entirely enough.